Good morning. Welcome to The Long Mekong. I'm your host, Dr. Digby James Wren, and today we're going to discuss the situation in Iran, and we'll also cover the situation with Russia and Ukraine, and we'll also look very closely at the situation in Southeast Asia and also politics of Australia in relation to energy and Donald Trump's attempt to impose a blockade on the Iranian blockade, which let's go to that first because that seems to have failed miserably, and I'm going to tell you why. Now, the first thing is that the idea that the Americans were going to blockade the blockade is only going to increase the problem. Everybody is aware of that, and the evidence of this, the first piece of evidence of this, is reports that the Saudis have changed their mind, where publicly they were saying that it need to be done diplomatically, so the Iranian situation should be brought to a conclusion diplomatically and through negotiations. Privately, it had been saying to the Americans that they were willing to support quietly the American attacks on Iran because they thought there was an advantage for the Saudis. They don't want to have Iran with a population of 90 million, a highly educated population, advanced manufacturing, capability to produce weapons. This was clearly they saw as a threat, and so if they could weaken Iran, they were willing to do so. A slight digression here is to say that while everybody says that Iran is a theocratic state run by the Ayatollahs, it does have a democratic base. It has democratic processes, and they have been exercised and publicly visible to everybody. But of course, they did have this supreme theocratic level just sitting above their democratic level. And so that continues, as we know. Now, the other thing is that the Saudis are also a theocratic state in real terms. Not many people know this, but actually power in Saudi Arabia is split between the Wahhabi family and the Saudi family. So the Saudis are the royal families and the Wahhabis run the religious side, and that has been in force for quite a long time, over a century in fact. So that's another theocratic state. And then the third theocratic state is in fact Israel. Now, while Israel is perhaps seen as being less theocratic, in real terms, Zionism is based in the idea of return from exile of Jews back to Judea. And of course, they are exercising that in the sense that, the biblical sense, that is in the Old Testament, that they can effect control over the area from the Nile to the Euphrates. Now that basically means all of the Middle East and East Africa into the Mediterranean. And that's effectively what the Americans have been trying to establish, so that they can then concentrate their forces in the Pacific to counter China. Which brings us to what has just happened. And that is that, and I've said this in all of my podcasts and in most of my writings, is that today, and in fact for the last, I think for at least the last almost 10 years now, China is in fact the most stable economy in the world, has the most stable currency in the world. It's the world's largest trading nation. It has invested enormous sums in infrastructure globally to promote trade, and that's what it has done. And one has to remember that this trade is not just with China. This is, of course, if you've got a port and a railway, it runs every which way. There is no limit to the amount of trading partners this infrastructure opens for countries, especially the BRICS countries and the emerging economies. But this is also true for Europe, South America, Mexico, and other nations. So, for example, in Southeast Asia and even Australia. Now, what has happened? The Chinese hosted Xi Jinping, hosted the leader, the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, so the United Arab Emirates, in which he suggested a 4-point plan, 4 principles for peace, which of course is based on sovereignty, non-interference with neighbors, a shared future for all of them. They must work together, and this has always been China's view. Now, at the same time, Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, has also had a very lengthy discussion. I believe the readout from that, extensive readout from that, is available publicly on TASS. The Xi Jinping's meeting with the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi is also available online, so I suggest that everybody go and have a look at those. But we can see that that is now going to bring the UAE into line with the idea of acting regionally with its partners, so the Arab countries, the GCC, but also, of course, that means working with Iran and Turkey and other partners in the region. Now, as I said, specifically, I think it was 2 weeks ago, the best possible outcome, solution, could be found through the partnership of the BRICS nations. Now, the BRICS Plus includes the countries that surround the Red Sea and West Asia, and that includes Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, Turkey, and Ethiopia. Now, 3 of those countries went to Pakistan: Turkey, Saudi Arabia, UAE. But we have to remember, in the BRICS also we have Russia and China. And so now what we see is that effectively what we're going to see here, I believe, is actually the implementation of what I suggested, which is in real terms that those BRICS countries, which basically embrace the area, so all of the trade routes in the Red Sea and Strait of Hormuz, are going to have to set up their own security architecture. Now, that means that the Americans are no longer going to be the security guarantors, and they've basically given up that possibility because their security guarantees were weaponized. And of course, they are now a liability for the region. And I can see in the very near future that it's going to become untenable for the Americans to maintain their bases in the region. That looks like the outcome over time. And we have also seen the real limits of American power. They are no longer able to enforce militarily their demands on other countries in the region. Now, everybody can see this, and that is what's going to propel the stability provided by China and its partners in the BRICS, and also, of course, with the SCO, because remember that India and Pakistan, Saudis are observers in this, are members of SCO. Turkey also, even though it's a member of NATO, is also an observer in that. And they are also going to be working more closely together, quietly, as China tries to build consensus, and I can see that that is really working. And this is the best possible outcome, actually, because it means that the region will then provide its own security guarantees. Now, Russia is also confronted with a similar situation in Ukraine, where the Europeans continue to increase their defense spending, to make clearly illegal, or at least questionably legal, and the Russians have brought a legal case against the Europeans over the $300 billion of assets that were seized, and the $90 billion that were supposed to be paid into the Ukraine that had been blocked by Viktor Orban. Now, Viktor Orban lost the election to Magyar, but now that Magyar knows, he's received all the security briefings and the financial briefings about the state, he understands that it is not in Hungary's interest or in Central Europe's interest at all to be funding more war in Ukraine and destabilizing all of Europe, basically. Now, Russia clearly has the upper hand. I suggest everybody go and have a look at, there's a website called Weeb Union. You can see that on YouTube. He gives very good, clear mapping, updates, very little bias. I think he's from Denmark. He's very, very good. He's been doing this for a long time. And have a look at that, and you will just see what's really happening on the ground in Ukraine. And it's clear that the Russians are now going to gain complete control over Donbass, And then, as we speak, they're starting to take control of Kursk and Sumy in the north, and they have finally decided to not allow Ukrainian shipping out of the Odessa, and I believe there have been attacks on the ships in Odessa, including one on a grain shipment, which is unusual, but I think that the Russians have been able to do that because of all of the attention received by the American and Israeli actions in the West Asia against Iran, and so now the Russians are taking advantage of that to advance their interests. And as I have long said, Russia needs to get to the Dnieper, anywhere on the Dnieper basically. Originally I believed that just taking control of Kiev, Dnipro and Odessa would do it, but that's a very big ask, that could take a long time to achieve actually. But once they have access to the Dnieper, then they can control the flow of transport along the Dnieper, and that will give them effective control over the entire region's economy. And we can see also that the European nations, UK and France, say they're going to send troops into Ukraine. Well, what do they mean is the western part of Ukraine, the west of the Dnieper. And if anybody knows their history or wants to look it up, they will find that that part of the Ukraine has always been in flux, and there are so many competing claims on territory by Romania, by Poland, by Lithuania, by Moldova. All of these countries have claims on that territory, and Germany too. So, and I think this is a key part of this, and that is that if Europe keeps going down this track, where they refuse the small group of elite, unelected leaders of the European Commission, continue down this track, they are going to continue to weaken the European economy. Now, the Europeans have made trade deals, sure, South America, with Australia, with Southeast Asia, with India. Fine, great, they're going to have more trade. Hopefully, what are they trying to do is services, basically, but other, their manufacturing industries as well. But quietly, they're also doing cooperative agreements for production, especially the Germans with vehicle manufacture and other things. The Europeans are putting themselves in a situation here that can only worsen their real situation. And I think that you can see that Starmer has become quiet recently because of domestic pressure on their economy. I think the UK is very close to being in a state of crisis. France has an economic crisis in hand. Macron is a lame duck. What's going to happen next year when their elections happen is anybody's guess, but clearly the centre-right and right politics in Europe are gaining the upper hand slowly, and what we're seeing is the centre is being squashed and becoming smaller and smaller, and those are the current elites that are running the country, running the European Union, and they are in a tighter and tighter predicament. And so the situation that they have with Donald Trump and with NATO is only going to become worse. And so that gives us the chance now to segue into what Donald Trump has been doing. Well, besides posting pictures of himself as Jesus or a divine figure, healing the sick. I suppose those sick are supposed to be everybody else, everybody that's not an American. And this image was, even MAGA supporters have objected to this image, and it was pulled down within, I think, less than 24 hours. But it's a very, very disturbing idea that you have this kind of, that Trump is providing this kind of iconography, which reminds one of steps towards megalomania. And I have long said that Trump is a hidden tyrant. And the problem here is, for Trump, is not that he's gained power and not that he's mastered media, but he has never mastered history or the understanding of other civilizations and societies and what drives them and what their real position is and how they really think about things. He continues just to believe that everybody just thinks that the laws of attraction work in US favor, and this is clearly no longer true. Now, we just should mention here something about the price of oil. Now, because the Americans have really, what this is all about, fundamentally has been the control of oil markets. So Venezuela, and that cut off China, but also meant that the US could add to its balance sheet of oil, votes, power, etc., Venezuelan stockpiles, which are enormous, also of gold and other minerals. But then he would try and add to that control of Hormuz and Iranian oil, which would give the United States an enormous power to set pricing and supply, but weaponized. Well, nobody really wants that. I mean, only the US wants that. But what one has to remember is that US oil is very expensive oil, and US gas is expensive gas. It's a very, very expensive. Sure, they have lots of it, but it costs more to produce and to ship because it has to be shipped across vast oceans. Whereas West Asia, of course, that is not true. There's only one ocean or even pipelines available. So Strait of Hormuz, Red Sea. And so in the US's attempt, in Trump's attempt to gain control over global oil markets, it's sort of worked in some ways, but it means that the United States has become more dependent on fossil fuels. And what they've ignored is how balanced the economy of China is in terms of energy. The first electro state, it produces far more electricity than the United States produces per capita, and is therefore able to run its manufacturing, advanced manufacturing, and data centers and AI and all those sorts of things. Whereas the Americans, of course, don't have that infrastructure. And how are they going to build it? And the only way they can build it, and this has been pointed out by a number of people, is that they're going to have to import Chinese equipment to build out their to electrify their economy more, to support these new AI centers and so forth. Globalization still exists because all of the large tech companies in America have been putting data centers into energy-rich the Middle East, and those are clearly under threat. What the Americans need to do is be able to keep the price of oil above their production costs, but their production costs are so high. So over $60 a barrel is basically the point where they can make money. So at $100 a barrel, the oil companies are just laughing. They're just they're raking in the money. And of course they're limiting the supply of oil from other producers, and they've always done this, by the way, placing sanctions on Russia, placing sanctions on Iran, placing sanctions on Venezuela and other suppliers of oil around the world, has indeed kept the prices high and given them the advantage. The destruction of Nord Stream 2, I mean, that's just blatantly illegal, and starting to destroy infrastructure in this way was always a bad move, and nobody could have thought that that was a good thing in any real terms other than the oil companies and their political acolytes. Anyway, enough of that said. But the problem here is that the AI boom and the funding of the AI boom and the building of data centers, needs more electricity, which they don't have yet, and that's going to take years to do, and they're going to have to import from China and other countries the equipment needed to do so, to build that out as fast as they can. And doing it on fossil fuels is going to be very difficult and very dirty. And what I'm trying to say here is that the failure to be able to control Hormuz means that the oil price, once the oil stability is regained under the aegis of China, Russia, and the BRICS partners around West Asia, the price of oil could drop quite rapidly. And dare I say that if the price could drop below $60 a barrel, it would be a boom for the Europeans, the Asians, all of Asia, South America, everywhere else. But it would be highly detrimental to the petrol energy markets of the Americans. Now, just there, I want to also just quickly go and have a look at the Australian problem. The Australian problem, where previous government allowed their oil reserves to be held in the United States, 10,000 kilometers away. That is not security. How is Australia supposed to supply itself? Now, Prime Minister Albanese has been walking a very fine line, trying to balance his economy by exporting commodities basically to China and service industries into most of Asia, what they call diversification. To some extent that has worked. The Chinese have been quite moderate in their reaction to that, been quite open to that, understanding of course that there was a separation between the security arrangements with the Americans. But now the Australians must be questioning, and are questioning, this arrangement. How can they better do this? Well, going to Singapore, which doesn't have any oil at all, only processing, and trying to get a guarantee, which basically means getting a VIP seat. So we'll be first, we'll be supplied first. So Singapore should be supplying Australia first, but it still needs to get the oil from the Middle East. Singapore's oil comes from the Middle East. So this, while it's a short-term panacea, very short-term in real terms, I think, but the longer-term problem. So what have the Australians done? They're doing the transition to new energy, and to do that they've partnered with China in real terms, in terms of EVs and turbines and all that sort of thing. But at the same time, relying on American security, and then tying themselves up in military alliances for weapon systems that are going to make them even more dependent on America. Now, Canada is a good example of trying to step away from that, and the Australians and the Canadians have had very detailed discussions about this, and I think that very quietly in the halls of power in Canberra they're understanding that they need to be thinking about this in a much more holistic way, and in a far less blind following of American security concerns or American security actions in the area. So Australia has no excuse for the situation it's in, although I do believe now that it's going to be very, very difficult for Australia to do anything other than go to nuclear energy, because they cannot export their energy and at the same time supply sufficient energy to their own home market to have their energy inputs low enough to make Australia more viable in terms of export, to reduce the costs. So the transition to new energy is key, but they still need to electrify, and doing that on natural gas and oil is really not a good idea. Oil needs to be imported and natural gas is exported. If they were to divert the energy, then they would not have export income. So they're in a real bind with this one. Yes, it clearly looks like nuclear is going to be the only option they have going forward, unless they can electrify to a very vast degree, and they do not have hydropower possibilities like China does, or other countries with vast resources of water. Australia does not have vast resources of water. Anyway, that's just a slight digression to say, but to sum that up, the Australians yesterday had announced that they were going to send SAS, Special Forces troops, to support the Americans, and were ready to send ships for the blockade. Well, this is clearly not going to work, is it? And this, once again, this is where the Australians have blindly said what they would do, in the face of the facts that work against them trying to do that. They should never have done this. It was clearly a mistake. And there's been a redistribution of power in the Australian military as well. I don't know how that connects exactly to the situation, but clearly this was a poor choice, and that's going to die. Now, India, of course, also has gone very, very quiet, because it depends enormously on the import of energy from the West Asia. And so they've said nothing about Pakistan mediating the situation in West Asia. They've kept very, very quiet about this, and we understand why, of course, because they're energy dependent. What are they going to do? But quietly they are still making overtures and opening up towards trading with China, and this is a part of the BRICS, of course. It's also part of SCO, and it's also a reality on the ground economically that India is never going to be able to grow its economy at the rate it is now unless it has open or much improved trade with China and has resources from both Russia and also from the West Asia. This is very important, and of course India wants control over the Indian Ocean. And they're in competition with China for that, but it's competition, and it has not gone further than that. And despite the desires of some powers to keep creating problems at 5,000 meters in the Himalayas, which is fighting a war there is impossible. These can only be small skirmishes, but it makes great narrative. We should just forget about that and concentrate on the fact that China has quietly been working with India to open trade routes again, to make their arrangements work for both powers. And here they have the potential of what I might call the golden triangle, and that is Russian energy, Russian power, Russian technological know-how, Russian weapons, etc. The Russians have extraordinarily advanced education system. They have everything they need, and that triangle could power the world economy for the next 50 years without any doubts at all, if they can get it together, and also with the BRICS plus countries in West Asia. So let's just have a quick look now at what is going on with South Korea and Russia and Japan. Both totally energy dependent on West Asia. Now, Japan has been trying to increase its energy supply from Russia. It seems that South Korea should really do the same to me. There's no reason for them not to do that. Sure, it can open to West Asia again, but they're going to have the same problem. It's still got to travel so far. Russian energy is available cheaply and reliably, very, very close to those two countries. And I think there's a real reason for them to be able to want to do that. And that, at the end of the day, I think Singapore and Australia should also think about not just doing that, but not opposing it. Why not? On the open markets. And then, of course, there's all of the possibilities of African producers, Angola and Algeria and others, with gas and oil. That's all available. Guyana, French Guiana, Brazil, Mexico, all have access and able to export some energy. Even Southeast Asian countries like Indonesia and Malaysia are able to do that. And so this kind of, the open markets are supposed to make this happen. And it's the Americans that oppose this the most. So I think all of these need to really reconsider how this configuration works. Now, the problem here, the greater problem that we haven't touched on yet, is what is the state of the US economy? Just how fragile is it? Now, one has to worry every time that Donald Trump says America has the finest military, America has the most oil, America has the finest technology, America has the best of everything. What he's really saying is what he wants, not what is actually true. And the financial situation, the economic situation of the Americans is actually perilous. As I said before, if oil prices drop below $60 or even just near $60, it becomes very difficult for the Americans to make money. If there's alternative LNG supplies available, nobody's going to want to ship them across the ocean more expensively. It doesn't make sense. Canada is taking advantage of this weakness, and they have access to the Pacific Ocean and to the Atlantic Ocean. They have vast resources, and they're able to take care of that too. And they're looking for some kind of hedging and balancing, and so are the Australians. So, all in all, the situation we're in right now is that what's driving Trump and the Americans is their very old imperial thinking. I mean, Trump is literally trying to interpose late 19th century American empire on the rest of the world, without realizing, of course, that ship has sailed a long time ago, and they're trying to create something that can never be recreated. America's situation right now is that, sure, it can dominate the Western Hemisphere militarily, and it can abduct leaders and commit assassinations of leaders, and it can get away with that, especially in the Western Hemisphere, and that's their stated objective. But as I've said, and I've written an article which is available, I think, in LinkedIn. If you just look up my name, Digby James Wren, and on LinkedIn you'll find that article just stating that the acquisition of Greenland and the extension of American power out to Greenland, up into the Arctic, down to Panama Canal, down through Argentina and Colombia and Venezuela. So that basically is sort of like, if you look at it as a map, you can see that Greenland is kind of like the head, and Alaska and Newfoundland in Canada sort of create the shoulders, if you like. The US is the torso, Panama is the waist, then you have the hips of Colombia and Venezuela, and then Argentina provides the legs all the way down to the Antarctic. So that's a kind of a, I suppose, a atlas situation. You've got this sort of rising giant, if you like. It could be pictured like that. It looks very much like that, interestingly. And that's basically the fallback position for the United States. And now they know that that's the case, that's why they're doing it. But what it also does is it adds to their balance sheet, because of all of the assets that they're going to get, right? Millions of square kilometers of land and millions of square kilometers of sea to be exploited, and domination over, especially over Colombia and Venezuela and down to Bolivia and Ecuador. As Rubio famously said, everything above the equator is not the global south. Well, what he means to say is, of course, that's going to be directly under what you might call the Western Hemisphere, under the Monroe Doctrine. Look, this may be feasible in the shorter term. It may work. We can see that there's a naval group, carrier group now sailing around South America, exerting pressure on Colombia. Venezuela is already de facto under American influence, but they're going to end up in Cuba, we know that. Now, this failure of the blockade, the failure of military force against Iran, the failure to be able to place Israel as the dominant military power for the entire region means that he is going to have to seek another victory. He's building a victory arch. I've said this before. Well, why is he doing that? Is it just because of empire and nostalgia? No, it's because he really sees himself, as he put in that picture, as the world's savior. He sees himself as some kind of divine figure, a megalomaniac of real danger, basically becoming a tyrant, and this is not going to be sustainable. It can't be. It won't work. So he's going to need another victory. So Venezuela was an easy victory. I think Greenland could also be. But right now he's going to concentrate on Colombia and Cuba. He needs to get control over Colombia, over their resources, but very specifically the fact that he can control all of the top of South America and have effective kind of influence over Mexico's economy. Although I think Mexico really is going to be a rising power, and that's going to be harder and harder. And I wonder at some point if Spanish is not going to become more important in many states of America than English. And I think that over time, and I mean many decades and possibly a century, there's a very good possibility that Americans won't be speaking English nearly as much as they are now. He needs a victory, and he's going to try and find it in Colombia, or in Cuba and Greenland, and maybe all three. And so that would give them this effective atlas situation that I'm talking about, from the Arctic to the Antarctic, and be able to block all of those trade routes. So that's going to be opposed by the emerging economies for sure. The Europeans, foolishly, are probably going to go along with this, even though they object to Greenland, but at the end of the day, they're powerless to stop this in real terms. If he really wants it, he can do it. I think they will end up doing it. But they're going to have to give up something else. And I think what they're going to give up is their bases in the Middle East. But Israel is not going to be the dominant power. Sure, it's going to remain powerful. But as I've said to you before, the BRICS countries that embrace that whole region are more powerful, and it's more in their interest, economic interest, because remember, Israel is a very small country with a very small economy in real terms. And it might be everything you think it is. People talk about how wonderful they are, how powerful they are, how well trained they are, and how much technology they have, and how clever they are, and so forth and so on. But without American money, none of it would happen. So I think those bases are destined for the dustbin at some point in some way, maybe not in the too distant future. So I think I'll call it quits there. Although I will just say one final thing about that, and that is that the same situation applies in Southeast Asia. We can see that is also true. BRICS. Thailand has just taken Chinese subs with Chinese engines because the Germans wouldn't provide them. Vietnam also is part of BRICS. Indonesia, part of BRICS. Malaysia, part of BRICS. And the same kind of thing is happening here for the South China Sea. What you're going to get is these emerging economies, middle-sized economies, middle powers, as part of the BRICS, and they're going to exert regional control by working together because it benefits their people and their economies to take control of their own security. Now, at this point, Australia is probably going to try and work against this under the aegis of the Americans, but I think the Australians need to think very, very carefully about that, about how they're going to position themselves, and the AUKUS arrangements and the critical mineral arrangements that they're setting up right now may work in the shorter term, may have some advantages, especially in relation to nuclear, as I mentioned, for Australia, but in the longer term it's not going to work. They're going to have to rethink how they align themselves as a middle power, and I think Canada also. Now, while Carney has suggested this middle power bloc, which is basically the Europeans, the Canadians, the Australians, he's counting on the Indians, although I think that's highly unlikely in real terms at the end of the day. It's really just an extension of the liberal transmission bloc. That it really sort of supports the American position no matter what, even though Canada says it's not part of that. It still supports the American position. I won't say less discreetly, but let's just say at a slight distance. But it's the same thing, and of course it's supposed to be values driven, etc., etc. And as a professional, an IR professional, every time somebody starts talking to me about values, I begin to worry enormously because those values seem to change at any instance, whenever it suits them, and of course that's obvious in the Carney speeches about the new, about a new order that's required, a new rules-based order. Well, who's going to set that? And I think that we can see that China and Russia and India and the BRICS countries are the ones that are going to set that. And the old narrative of who sets the rules, sets everything, is not going to apply to the Americans anymore. It clearly doesn't apply to the British. It clearly doesn't apply to the French, although I think the French do have some potential to interact in a better way. And I suppose that the very last thing I want to say is that Germany, I think Russia must always be worried about the rise of a Fourth Reich, and I think there is a groundswell of something going on there, and we need to be very careful about what the Germans are going to do in that way, especially with the election cycles that are coming up in 2027 and 2028, and that includes the American elections, that includes elections in Australia, that includes elections in Europe, everywhere in Europe. There'll be another election in Japan, another election in South Korea. And if the Americans continue what they're doing in Southeast Asia right now, specifically with where I am in Cambodia, with Thailand, Malaysia and Indonesia, it does not bode well. And I think that if the BRICS can show that they can mediate and control their own security in West Asia, then there's the great potential that they'll be able to do the same thing for Southeast Asia. And then even possibly in South America. Africa we're going to leave for another time. I think that's enough for today. I don't normally speak at this length. Thank you for your attention, and I'll be talking to you again very soon. Goodbye.